Hello, so this is lesson 3. This is in the second booklet that you'll have, and it's looking at global efforts towards sustainability. So we're going to be looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. Hopefully you've got some context of what they are before. We're going to look at how we've got there, how we're working through it at the moment, when they were introduced, and recap a little bit over the Brundtland report again. So let's get started. So, the language that is used to describe countries. In front of you, you'll hopefully be able to see we've got some countries are seen as least developed, others most developed. We've got developing and developed. We've got the higher, upper middle, the lower middle, and the low income countries as defined by the World Bank. And we've got global north and global south. So, of those 4 different groups of terms, I'd like you to just pause this video. What do you think those terms mean to you? Are there any useful ways that we can use these terms? Are there any negatives about them? And which terms do you think are best to use? So, looking at those 4 groups of terms, from the least developed to the most developed, it's okay. Um, it kind of acknowledges the fact that no country is fully sustainable, but there is a lack of clarity over what we're talking about when it comes to development. Is it economically developed? Are they socially developed? What does that really mean? Then, when it comes to developing or developed, again, we've got this lack of clarity over what that actually means. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that actually no country is fully sustainable. Is any country fully developed if we're thinking about it in terms of achieving all 3 pillars of sustainability? The World Bank definition of upper or higher, upper middle, and low income countries offers us a high level of clarity, but it's only reflecting factual values. So it's looking at economic growth and economic sustainability and doesn't bring in a wide range of these measures. And then you've probably heard of the global north and the global south. It's so unclear how this is decided by the name, and it moves away from this idea of the developed. However, when we're talking about the global north, we're generally talking about richer countries, and the global south being our less economically developed countries. But we know that's not always the case. And so the one we will generally look at is the World Bank categories. So higher, upper middle, and low income countries, because it's based on values, it's bringing economics into it. Granted, it's not bringing lots of other factors together, but it is fairly okay. Okay, let's start to think about why sustainability is seen as a global issue. So there are 6 different reasons here. Firstly, countries need to work together to achieve sustainability. No single country can do it on their own. In the main, this is because of the impact of climate change and biodiversity loss, which is not limited to particular locations. Thirdly, international technologies, so sharing and trade, can support the developing nations to achieve social and economic development goals without environmental degradation associated with achieving those goals that happens in our more developed nations. This international technology sharing and trade can support a faster transition to a cleaner economy in more developed nations. Economic and social decisions of one nation can affect other nations, such as immigration, taxation policies, that kind of thing. And finally, international trade agreements can lead to greater prosperity. And so there's a greater capacity to meet society's needs and this transition towards environmental sustainability. If you think back to this donut economics, once society's needs have been met, it's really hard for countries to not reach this ecological ceiling and break through it and start to have a negative impact on the environment. So I'd like you to take 30 seconds, pause the video and have a think. What would you do if you were trying to introduce a sustainability policy to the world? How would you do it? What would you introduce? Pause it here and we'll come back to it. Okay, so we're now going to break down the history of how we've got to where we are. Currently, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're going to go back to the Brundtland Report in 1987 and look at how we've got to where we are. We're going to look in a little bit more detail, but here is your general overview. So in 1987, the publication of the Brundtland Report, or commonly known as Our Common Future, was published by the United Nations. Then in 1995 was the first COP conference, or the UN Climate Change Conference, and they have been held annually since then, other than 2020 due to COVID and bans on international travel. In the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were adopted with a deadline of 2015. There were 8 goals in total, looking at social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And then in 2015, the Millennium Development Goals finished, not necessarily were met, and then the Sustainable Development Goals were introduced with a deadline of 2030, so not too long away now, and they built upon the Millennium Development Goals. So this is the Brundtland Report. It's called Our Common Future, and it's looking specifically at sustainability across the world. So you don't need to know loads of detail about the Brundtland Report, but this is what is helpful for you to know. There are various crises in part one of the report. It highlights that there is a concern of uneven distribution of overconsumption of natural resources across the world. There is uneven distribution of wealth and its economic and social consequences. It talks about the crises of overuse of environmental resources, which severely impact future generations, so therefore not being sustainable. This is what leads to the sustainable development section, which is describing what it then means to be more sustainable. And then in 1995, we had the first COP conference, so the Conference of the Parties, where members of the United Framework on Climate Change come together. Often we see it as world leaders. A few years ago, there was one here in the UK, in Glasgow, and they are held annually to meet and negotiate and put pressure on various different governments and intergovernmental organisations to come up with what we call a multilateral response, bringing governments, charities, businesses together to try and respond to climate change. So this group, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, their treaty aims to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic or human-induced interference with the climate system. Now, that's quite a big goal for one particular conference, and you may know a little bit about these conferences already. How effective they are, we don't really know. Often countries leave with a pledge to not increase their climate emissions or whatever it may be. But because these are not policies that are put in place, they're not laws, they're not often fully followed through with. So the effectiveness of these COP conferences is up for debate. And then in the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were introduced. Now, these are the 8 goals that focus on action in what we called developing nations. So these are our countries that still needed to develop. Hopefully, you will notice that there are 3 quite distinctive categories. So, looking at Goal 1, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, hopefully you can easily identify that that is to do with social sustainability. Goal 2, to achieve universal primary education, again, to do with social sustainability. To promote gender equality and to empower women, again, social sustainability. To reduce child mortality rates, that is the death of a child under the age of 1, again, social sustainability. Improving maternal health, social sustainability. To combat AIDS, HIV, malaria, and other diseases, again, social sustainability. You will notice that HIV and AIDS, as well as malaria, are much more present in what we call our developing nations. You don't really see them in the UK. You see HIV and AIDS more so now, but especially back in 2000, these were the diseases that were facing our developing nations. And so that is important to note when we're thinking about our Millennium Development Goals. Okay, Goal 7 really clearly is to ensure environmental sustainability. It's to do with the environment. And then finally, Goal 8 was to develop a global partnership for development. And so this brings in all aspects of sustainability, social, economic, and environmental, to help other countries achieve their goals. So in the year 2015, the Millennium Development Goals ended. They weren't necessarily all achieved, and the Sustainable Development Goals replaced them. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals rather than the 8 Millennium Development Goals, and they target the causes of problems as well as the problems themselves. That's important to note because when we were looking at the Millennium Development Goals, that was much more focused on the problems rather than the causes of said problems. And hopefully you will be able to note they are goals for all countries, not just our developing nations. So every country has the responsibility to work towards these sustainable development goals. Hopefully you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. You may have seen them before, you might not have, and so we're going to talk through some of these. I would like you to be thinking about how these relate to the previous Millennium Development Goals as well. So goal number 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals is no poverty. That really clearly builds on goal 1 of the Millennium Development Goals, which was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Goal 2, zero hunger. Again, building on goal 1 of the Millennium Development Goals. Good health and well-being is to do with social sustainability and builds upon goal number 4, so to reduce child mortality from the Millennium Development Goals. Quality education, again, builds upon the Millennium Development Goals number 2, which was to achieve universal primary education. Gender equality, so this is not just about women anymore, this is all about all sexes, and that builds upon the Millennium Development Goal number 3, which was to promote gender equality and to empower women. Clean water and sanitation brings in social sustainability, but also environmental as well. And I guess elements of economic as well, because if people have clean water and sanitation, they're more likely to be able to go to work and various other things like that. And it builds upon goal number 7 from the Millennium Development Goals, looking at ensuring environmental sustainability. Okay, the following goals don't necessarily build upon the Millennium Development Goals. If you remember, most of them were looking at social sustainability, one on environmental, and then there was one that kind of brought everything together. So goals 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 don't follow on from anything else. And 16, I think. Yeah, and 16. So these are much more focused on economics. So affordable and clean energy is to do with economics, but also environmental. Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. Again, mainly environmental, but also somewhat social when we're thinking about our decent work. Number 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Industry and innovation are obviously to do with economics, but infrastructure could also be talking about social sustainability. So if you're thinking about the infrastructure needed for a society to thrive, things like hospitals, education, facilities, that kind of thing, that's the infrastructure that we're talking about here. Number 10 is reduce inequalities. That can link to goal number 3 of the Millennium Development Goals, looking at promoting gender equality and to empower women. It's also reduce inequalities in terms of economics as well. Sustainable cities and communities is goal 11, and responsible consumption and production is to goal 12, to do with environmental sustainability. Goal 13, 14 and 15 all built upon the Millennium Development Goal number 7 to ensure environmental sustainability. We're looking at climate action, life below water, and then life on land. Goal number 16 is to achieve peace, justice, and strong institutions. That doesn't necessarily build on any of the Millennium Development Goals, but is a key focus for the United Nations. And then finally, hopefully you will notice this goal 17 is incredibly similar to goal 8 of the Millennium Development Goals, which was a partnership for development, and this is a partnership for the goals. I would like you to take a minute, pause this video, and try and answer these questions. So, how do the Sustainable Development Goals relate to the previous MDGs? Which directly follow on? Are there any that relate to more than one Millennium Development Goal? Are there any which relate, or any of the Millennium Development Goals that relate to more than one Sustainable Development Goal? And which Sustainable Development Goals don't have a direct link with the Millennium Development Goals? We have talked through a lot of this, but if you could put this together, that would be great. So if what I've just been saying has been a little bit overwhelming, here is quite a nice visual for you. So goal 1 meets goal 1. Goal 1 is now goal 2 in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm just going to flick through these, so hopefully you can see the links between the various different goals and where we are at now. And the final thing we're going to talk about today is how the COP conferences link to the Sustainable Development Goals. So mainly the COP conferences are looking at goal number 13, climate action, but it also relates to goal 14, 15, 7 and 17. So life below water, life on land, affordable and clean energy, and a partnership for the goals. So here's a quote for you from the United Nations. It says, Of the 17 goals, number 13 calls for urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. But all of the goals influence climate change and vice versa. That is directly from the United Nations. And finally, it is really helpful for you to know these sustainable development goals. So your task before your next lesson is to learn these 17 goals. You don't need to know anything more about them other than the goals and if they link to social, economic, or environmental sustainability. If you could, at the end of this lesson, fill in the end of topic quiz or end of lesson quiz thing on your Google Classroom, that would be great. And I will see you next time.